Hi everybody, got this 1985 standard Strat in for service today, and I thought it might be an ideal opportunity really to have a chat about where this guitar fits into Fender's history. A part of Fender's history that I don't think many people know much about. Back in the mid-70s, of course, Fender were doing great business, selling more guitars than they'd ever sold before. But by the end of the 1970s, the guitar industry was taking a bit of a downturn. Fashion especially had changed, but also they were facing real competition from Japanese manufacturers. Costs were rising in the USA, where they were stable in Japan, and that meant that they could bring guitars into the US market at very, very competitive prices, and this was really damaging Fender's bottom line. In 1980, CBS decided they had to turn the company around, and to do that they brought in a new CEO, a fellow called Bill Schultz. Now, he decided that the best way to play the Japanese at their own game was to literally play the Japanese at their own game. And he went to Japan, forged a partnership with some Japanese companies to have them make Fender guitars in Japan for export back to the Europe and US markets. Now, this, of course, was the original Squier guitars, and the Squier by Fender logo is actually one that's still sought after today. Those guitars were very, very good guitars. Production of those started in 1982. However, it was a bit too late for CBS. By 1984, they were still hemorrhaging money from Fender and were slowly closing the Fender production down in the USA. In fact, by the middle of 1984, there were very few guitars being made. They'd laid off a lot of the staff at Fullerton, and by the end of 1984, there was nothing left but a skeleton crew of QC engineers, basically going through what was left, making the best of what they had to sell off, and to prepare some models for NAMM 85. This is where Bill Schultz really gets going, because he gets a team of investors and buys the intellectual property of Fender from CBS. Fender Musical Instrument Corporation, the company that we now know as Fender, was born in February 1985. But of course, they only bought the intellectual property. They didn't buy the Fullerton plant, so they had an immediate problem. Where were they going to make their guitars? Well, the plan was always to make high-end guitars in America, but their standard guitars were to be transferred to their Japanese partners. And this is one of those guitars. But of course, very early on, they hadn't had a chance to change very much or retool. They just had to keep going. So in reality, this is part of that crossover era between the old Fender company and what was Squier in Japan, and the new Fender company that was going to be born out of the ashes of the CBS Fender. And looking at this guitar, you can see that it really is a hybrid of those two eras. So for example, it's very much a vintage style instrument, which was very much what Squier were doing in Japan. It's got a vintage style tremolo with the folded saddles, the original width from the 1950s, which leaves the strings nice and close to the edge of the fingerboard. It's got the original 1950s style scratch plate, so it's a single ply scratch plate with 8 holes rather than 11. Inside though, this is very much Squier territory. These pickups are driven by ceramic bar magnets underneath the pole pieces. It had a 5-way switch, but it was one of the enclosed plastic ones which you'd have seen on the Squiers of the time. 3 full-size Japanese pots. In fact, 2 of them survived. I had to throw away the switch. The neck, again, very much a vintage style neck, 7¼ inch radius, heel truss adjustment. Back to the 1950s shape with the headstock, of course, and that, of course, is also something that Fender had done in America by 1982. It's got the small frets. It does feel very much like a vintage instrument, a very C-shaped 60s neck. And overall, it plays now very, very well. It's got Japanese tuners, the Gotos. And in fact, the only real nod to modernity that this guitar really has is on the headstock with its new logo and its modern string trees. In reality, This is basically a Squier guitar badged up as Fender. But actually, it's hard to say that that's any real detriment to the guitar itself, because it actually plays very well. This neck has held up incredibly well for 37 years. It's still absolutely straight, and the truss rod operates perfectly well. But let's have a listen to it. Let's put a little bit of gain on it. And there you have it, the 1985 Japanese Fender Stratocaster, the first Stratocaster made outside of the USA to have that iconic name alone on the headstock. And that makes it a massively important guitar in Fender's history, because it really is Bill Schultz's future strategy for Fender, cast in wood. Because suddenly they had a guitar that they could make reliably, profitably, and still get it in the hands of the player at an affordable price. And that then possibly makes this the guitar that saved Fender. See you next time.